Good afternoon. We're so glad to have you with us for our program this afternoon. James Monroe, John Sidebottom, and the hidden history at the Battle of Trenton. So I'm Nancy Stetz, and I'm an education programs manager at Highland. And I'm going to start our program out today by setting a scene. On Christmas night in 1776, 18-year-old Lieutenant James Monroe crossed the Delaware River with George Washington's army, preparing for a surprise attack on the Hessians at Trenton, New Jersey. Monroe described the conditions that night in his autobiography, saying that the night was tempestuous and the conditions were made more severe by a heavy fall of snow. The following day at Trenton, on December the 26th, Monroe was shot in the left shoulder with a musket ball. Also in his autobiography, Monroe recalled that he was, quote, carried from the field, but doesn't provide the name of who carried him. Other biographers have provided the detail that Monroe was carried by 2 or 3 Virginians, but also without their names. This afternoon, we are really delighted to have the opportunity to hear from the 7th great-nephew of one of those quick-thinking and brave soldiers who carried Monroe with no knowledge that this wounded 18-year-old would one day become the 5th president. It's my pleasure to introduce you to our speaker, Caleb Dempsey-Richardson. I had the good fortune to encounter Caleb last summer when he was in Virginia doing some genealogy research and included Highland in his travel itinerary. He shared some really fascinating finds he discovered when researching his family history that I am very eager for you all to hear. So let me formally introduce you to Caleb. Caleb Dempsey-Richardson holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in history with an English minor from the University of Kentucky, a Master of Arts degree in English from Eastern Kentucky University, and a certificate in genealogical research from Boston University. He teaches first-year writing courses as well as ESL at Lindsey Wilson College in Kentucky. Caleb's research interests include narratology, the modalities of language, and how rhetorical appeals are effectively transmitted. While not originally from Kentucky, he has lived the majority of his life within the Commonwealth and has deep family roots in the Lake Cumberland region. So it is my pleasure to now turn you over to Caleb.
Thank you so much, Nancy, for that lovely introduction. And today I'm going to share, for those who might be interested, some research findings about James Monroe, the Battle of Trenton, and those who helped save his life there after he was seriously wounded. And it turns out that one of those two is a ancestral relative of mine. And the family that he's connected to is more interesting than first appearances might suggest, and actually links to a historically overlooked free family of color from the colonial era. So let me go ahead and share my screen with you all and pull up my materials. All right. So we get started here. So when you think of the Battle of Trenton, what you most likely might think, and what most Americans might think of, is this rather famous painting, Washington crossing the Delaware, right? That kind of mythical image of continental leadership. And interestingly, the figure right behind Washington is young Lieutenant Monroe holding the flag. And Monroe, as Nancy mentioned in his autobiography, recounts his exploits in the battle. And Monroe, interestingly, wrote in the style of, or recounted his life in third-person narration, which might seem like a rather odd technique by today's standard. But he was one of 2 officers wounded in the battle. And after Captain Washington, who, this being a cousin of General George Washington, is wounded towards the bottom there, moving on afterwards, he received a severe wound and was taken from the field. The command then devolved upon Lieutenant Monroe, who attacked in like manner at the head of the corps and was shot down by a musket ball, which passed through his breast and shoulder. He was also carried from the field. And in that instance, Monroe's recounting he was helped off the field of battle, but it's recounted in a rather passive way, was also carried from the field. But there are some other instances there, and as Nancy mentioned, where there's some more descriptive language used. And one of those being an article featured in the Daughters of the American Revolution magazine from December 1923 called James Monroe Soldier by Rose Governor Hose, in which she narrates a letter written by Monroe 6 months before his death in New York and owned by one of his descendants, dated January 9th, 1831, gives a modest description of his part in this great revolutionary battle. It reads, the relevant part for us here being, soon afterwards, I was shot through the shoulder by a ball which grazed the breast. I was carried by 2 or 3 soldiers, for I fell, to the room where Captain Washington was under the care of 2 surgeons. So here, Monroe's included a bit more descriptive detail and context that he was carried by 2 or 3 soldiers. And what's interesting about this is the author of that article, Rose Governor Hose, it was the great-granddaughter of President James Monroe. So in the commentary, when she mentions a letter owned by one of his descendants, she's either referring to herself or to another close relative who actually had that family letter, in which Monroe is mentioning being escorted by the 2 or 3 soldiers. And it turns out that the identity of these soldiers who helped save young wounded Lieutenant Monroe are actually were hidden like needles in a haystack in the Revolutionary War pension applications that date from the 18 teens and onward. But interestingly, that moment of young Lieutenant Monroe being wounded is featured in this famous painting by John Trumbull of the capture of the Hessians at Trenton, December 26, 1776. And you see there, the figure wounded on the ground is identified as being James Monroe himself. And the Yale listing doesn't name who the figure behind him is attending to his care, but David Hackett Fisher, in his Pulitzer Prize winning biography, Washington's Crossin', asserts that holding him is Dr. John Riker, who saved his life on the battlefield, more so conflating the series of events to one singular dramatic moment. But Monroe was not operated on the field of battle itself. That was after he'd been escorted off. So the first of the 2 people who helped save young Lieutenant Monroe is named James Hamilton. And his pension application dates to Frederick County, Virginia from May 1818, in which he's then 59 years old, and says that he enlisted in the county of Berkeley in the state of Virginia of the 4th Virginia Regiment on Continental Establishment. And the 4th Virginia Regiment, as we'll get to, is one of the ones that was actually at the Battle of Trenton. Now, the relevant part here is from his pension application on May 16th, 1850, a letter was sent to the pension office on behalf of Rebecca Hamilton, James Hamilton's widow, asking for an increase in her pension on the grounds that, quote, her husband was an officer at the Battle of Trenton, where he bore Colonel Monroe from the field of battle and received from him 750 acres of land for his gallantry. And there, even though the cursive in the script from 1850, as script is often hard to read, is due to the handwriting, this is the actual excerpt mentioning that. She claims that her husband was an officer, at the Battle of Trenton, and then highlighted where he bore Colonel Monroe. So As mentioned, James Hamilton was in the 4th Virginia Regiment. His military service dates to the right time period, joined in 1776, and indeed, the 4th Virginia Regiment was at the Battle of Trenton. In Fisher's book, referring back to Washington's Crossing, in an appendix, he lists all the assembled Continental troops in New Jersey on January 1st, 1777, which would have been mere days after the Battle of Trenton itself. And in Sterling's brigade, you can see, or excuse me, in Stevens' brigade, you can see Elliott's 4th Virginia Continental Regiment. So James Hamilton was right place, right time, exactly where his regiment was at the battle in question, to have been one of the 2 men who helped save the life of young James Monroe. And the other figure identified comes from the pension application of John Sidebottom. And his pension file originally dates to Clark County, Kentucky in May 1819, in which John Sidebottom, alias Sidebottom, the name is in a lot of the records of that era spelled either way, sometimes with a Y as well. So it hadn't standardized into what it became in the 20th and 21st centuries is just almost always Sidebottom. But highlighted here, you'll see that he joined the regiment by Colonel Whedon, misspelling there of Whedon, of George Whedon, and afterwards by Colonel Thomas Marshall, and that he enlisted in the year 1776 for 3 years in Captain Charles West Company of the 3rd Virginia Regiment on Continental Line, commanded by Colonel Marshall. And mentioned there is a figure of 1882, Charles Lander appeared before me and made out that he was in the same company and regiment with John Sidebottom, Captain West Company, 3rd Virginia Regiment, on the Continental Line, commanded by Colonel Whedon and Colonel Marshall. And just like with the 4th Virginia Regiment, the 3rd Virginia Regiment was also assembled at the Battle of Trenton, and its 2nd commander was George Whedon, and Whedon was succeeded in command by Colonel Thomas Marshall. And referring back to Washington's Crossing, whereas the 4th Virginia Regiment was at the Battle of Trenton and listed as being in New Jersey on January 1st, 1777, Whedon's 3rd Virginia Regiment was in Sterling's brigade and was just departing right at the start of the new year after the battle had ended. So both Virginia regiments are in the right place at the right time, at the right battle. And further on in Sidebottom's pension application, the key part of text here is on May 27th, 1844, Sam Hansen stated that he'd heard John Sidebottom say that he was one of the 2 men who bore from the field of battle during the Revolutionary War the late President of the United States, James Monroe, after he was wounded. And that's a really interesting detail too, in that Sidebottom, as Hansen recounts, Sidebottom said he was one of 2 men, because we already have independent confirmation from Monroe himself that it was 2 or 3 fellow soldiers who had escorted him off the field of battle. And Sidebottom's mention of it being 2 would line up also as well with Hamilton's claim that he was the other. And here's just an example of a muster roll for the 3rd Virginia Regiment, commanded by Colonel Thomas Marshall, for the month November 1777. And the bottom listed name is John Sidebottom, noting he enlisted in February 1776. And 2 names above him there is Charles Lander, who also joined in February 76. And half a century later shows up on Sidebottom's pension application, stating that he served with Sidebottom. So the details do match. And then here actually is the transcripted file from the pension application, where Lander, you can see there, signed it May 27th, 1844, recounts the episode of having heard from Sidebottom that he was one of the people who helped save Monroe's life. And following this, there's a very, very interesting file that offers some further corroboration of all of this as a supplemental file to John Sidebottom's complete pension file dated February 17th, 1907, in which a woman writing to the Department of the Interior states that I'm trying to establish a truth in connection with my paternal grandfather, John Sidebottom of 3rd Virginia Regiment. James Monroe was wounded in battle at Brandywine. Again, that's a mistranscription. It should be Trenton. And this man saved his life by carrying him on his back during the retreat. Oh, sorry, one sec. Too far there. Said she'd contacted the Library of Congress and referred them, they'd referred her to the Bureau of Pensions. But she mentions, it was grandfather's impression that Monroe made record of it. He wrote a letter and thanked him while he was president and said he would have a record made of it. But if he did so, we are unable to find it. I would give much to have it established as a truth and know that it looks like I carry on tradition. And it's signed to Mrs. E.C. Shelton, Gladstone, Missouri. And this person in question wrote the same department a decade earlier, signed Miss Wilda Sidebottom, Gladstone, Missouri in 1899. So the Mrs. E.C. Shelton is Wilda Portent Sidebottom, daughter of Peter Sidebottom and Emmeline Collier, granddaughter of Sidebottom and Jane McCarty. And Wilda was born in 1875 and died in 1972. So even though she was born some 50 years after her grandfather, John Sidebottom, alias Sidebottom, had died, being that generationally close, there were still elders and members that in her family who had this tradition that John Sidebottom and the later then actual president James Monroe had corresponded, and that Monroe had made record and knew of Sidebottom's identity and that Sidebottom had helped save his life. So that's a kind of tantalizing piece of evidence or reference to a letter having existed. But as Wilda mentions, if it did, she didn't know what had happened to it or in whose possession it might be. There is another clue to that, though, and that can actually be found in a volume published by the DAR titled Forgotten Patriots, African American and American Indian Patriots in the Revolutionary War, which was published in 2008. And in their chapter on Virginia, there's a key footnote, sort of reference of detail from a file of a Virginia genealogist named George Harrison Sanford King, letter to Dear Martha, dated 23rd November, 1982. And then cited from the George Harrison Sanford King collection, Virginia Historical Society, with the manuscript and file number. And the relevant quote being, and I have a long account and most interesting of one Sidebottom of this area helping to carry wounded James Monroe, then Colonel, actually Lieutenant, from the field of battle. Uncle J.M. never forgot Sidebottom. an omission of an M there, a mulatto. I have much of the story. So this seems like an interesting key corroboration to Wilda Sidebottom's mention of Monroe having actually transcribed this and either kept up correspondence or recounted in more detail and named the person who helped save his life after he was wounded at the Battle of Trenton. And interestingly, there, King refers to James Monroe as Uncle JN. So he's not that closely related to James Monroe, but King was actually a fifth cousin, 5 times removed from Monroe, and was descended through a paternal first cousin of Monroe's grandparents. So he was actually related to the family and was a collaterally sort of close connection in terms of being descended from a first cousin of Monroe, and was a huge Monroe family Stalin researcher. So it seemed like if anyone would have turned up evidence, even if only anecdotally, of this letter or document having existed, it would have been George Harrison Sanford King himself. And there later in Forgotten Patriots are listed John Sidebottom, alias Sidebottom, and Joseph Sidebottom, mixed descent, labeled as mulatto, and with the George Harrison Sanford King file as the reference. So this raises kind of a key question then in terms of the racial identity of the men themselves, right? Now, if we go to Charles Lander here, we'll see he having been cited in John Sidebottom's file and offering corroboration as serving in the same regiment at the same time. Charles Lander's pension file dates to Bourbon County and 1832. He mentions, here I acted as sergeant, had a corporal and 16 privates under my command, amongst whom were the following persons now recollected. Peter Brenner, Andrew Race, and then 2 colored men, to wit, John and Joseph Sidebottom. So Lander mentions not having only just served with them, but that they were people of mixed race status, right? That they were non-white individuals, and John and Joseph. And there's the original language of it. If you go to the 3rd line from the bottom, John and Joseph Sidebottom. So then if we pull up Joseph Sidebottom's pension application, Joseph was younger than John. His pension application dates to 1818, aged 63 in Henry County, Kentucky. That he, the said Joseph Sidebottom, enlisted in Prince William County in the state of Virginia in the company commanded by Charles West and the 3rd Virginia Regiment commanded by Colonel Whedon. And then further down, I, John Sidebottom of the county of Clark in state of Kentucky, established that further on that I knew in service Joseph Sidebottom, who is a brother of mine and served in the same company. So now we've got established that John and Joseph Sidebottom, living in Kentucky, albeit separate counties, in the 18 teens, making separate pension applications, are brothers, and that they're from Prince William County and appear to be veterans of color who served in the Revolutionary War. And here there's a copy of file from June 1777. Lander's labeled, and Charles Lander, 3 lines below that is John Sidebottom. But towards the bottom of the list, is Joseph Sidebottom. So they did all serve together in the 3rd Virginia Regiment. Now, interesting, a new relative shows up as further evidence. The evidence of Mrs. Catherine Davis taken before me, the subscriber, a justice of the peace, in and for the county of Prince William in the state of Virginia, August 1841. Question, did you know anything of Joseph and John Sidebottom respecting the Revolutionary War? Answer, as to Joseph Sidebottom, he enlisted and went to war. And then as to John Sidebottom, he enlisted and went to the war and did not return until the war was over. Question, what do you know respecting the heirs of John and Joseph Sidebottom? Answer, I know Nancy Sidebottom, a very old woman. She is the sister to both John and Joseph Sidebottom, and the only living heir to either of them that I know anything of that is living at this time. Given under my hand this August 27th, 1841, Catherine Davis, her mark. And the above sworn subscribed by the Justice of the Peace on August 1841. So this shows that someone in Prince William County was asked if there were any heirs or any relatives of the Sidebottom brothers who had served and then obviously later settled in Kentucky, still remaining. To wit, mention is made of a sister, Nancy Sidebottom, a very old woman, who was still alive at that time in August 1841. Now, she can be found here actually in the 1840 federal census. Anne Sidebottom, living in Eastern District, Prince William County, aged 70 to 79. And it should be noted that Nancy and Anne were variously treated as the same name at that point in time, Nancy being a nickname or diminutive form of the name Anne. And notice that she's listed as free white person, an elderly woman with one slave, female, between the ages of 10 and 23 in her household. So she was an elderly spinster, but listed as a white one. Now, I've never been able to find Anne/Nancy in the 1830 or 20 census records, but she does show up in 1810 in an interesting detail there. Nancy Sidebottom, residence place, Prince William County, Virginia. Number of all other free persons, 1. Number of household members, 1. So she's living by herself. And when looked at her neighbors, notice that all the markings are closer to the left hand of the page, but the one marking halfway down that is in that column all by itself is for free people of color. And that's actually Nancy. So she's identified as being mixed race in 1810 and is living in a household by herself. But all of her neighbors around her are white families. So in 1810, when we looked for Sidebottoms in Kentucky, the 3 senior Sidebottoms who show up are John Sidebottom of Clark County, free white person, male, 45 and older. Joseph Sidebottom in Henry County, free white person, male, 45 and older. And then in Pulaski County, Peter Sidebottom, free white, male, 45 and older. So Nancy Sidebottom, the one Sidebottom showing up in Prince William County, is indicated as being mixed race, but the 3 older individuals identified as Sidebottoms in Kentucky in 1810 are all listed as free white individuals. And if we take it back a decade earlier to 1800, the 1800 census almost completely burned during the War of 1812. So Tatt's records were used instead. And we see that there are 4 Sidebottoms listed: Charles, John, Joseph, and Peter. Charles in Greene County, John in Madison, Joseph and Henry, and Peter Sidebottom in Pulaski County. So this shows that the Sidebottoms who had come to Kentucky, maybe not in their initial moment of arrival, but upon reinvention and starting families and settling and building new lives, all became white or reinvented themselves as white individuals and crossed the color line. But still haven't fully established who the connections between Charles and Peter to John and Joseph, despite the uniqueness of that family name, right? So rather than trace their lives post-settlement in Kentucky, where there's a lot of records, let's look at where they were in Virginia beforehand and their further deeper origins. The earliest of them to make their way westwards and begin the migration to Kentucky is actually Charles. And from a volume entitled Annals of Southwest Virginia, halfway down the page there, see, at a court continued and held for Washington County, March the 17th, 1784. And then on the following page, this day came the parties by their attorneys, and thereupon came also a jury, to wit, and then a bunch of men are named, but one of the men named is Charles Sidebottom. So by 1784, Charles Sidebottom had began the westward migration towards Kentucky and was living in very far southwest corner of Virginia. And then in 1784, already in what would become Kentucky proper itself, we can find a copy of the marriage bond for Joseph Sidebottom. Shows Joseph Sidebottom and Patrick Shields are firmly held bound unto His Excellency, the Governor of Kentucky, the Governor of Virginia, because Kentucky was not yet a state. And the date August 1784, and this is going to be for Joseph Sidebottom's marriage to Agatha or Agnes Stapp. And below the signatures where Joseph Sidebottom and Patrick Shields giving their bond is listed Lincoln County. So Lincoln County was one of the original 3 counties of now present-day Kentucky, but to have been in Lincoln County, that meant that Joseph had migrated even further west than Charles had, and was within the territorial region that would come to become Kentucky itself. So he's in Kentucky, or what will become Kentucky proper, by 1784. This is a kind of fuzzy transcription, but if you can see partway down there on the left, Peter Sidebottom is listed, and he's in Washington County, Virginia, so southwest corner of Virginia, by 1787, and shows up in Lincoln County, Kentucky, on the tax list of 1790. And the last of those 4 Sidebottoms who can be placed here, it's hard to see, but John, marriages from a record of the family Bible from his pension files, John Sidebottom and Jenny, his wife, were bound in holy matrimony May the 28th, 1792. And by that point, John was in Madison County, Kentucky, where Jane, maiden name McCarty, was. So John also shows up by the early 1790s in central bluegrass region of Kentucky. So all 4 show up over the course of the 1780s. But before that, before the 1790s and before the later 1780s, if we look at a report compiled of people who'd been in Prince William County, we can see there that John Sidebottom is listed as being in Prince William County in 1783 and 1785, and 2 new Sidebottom names show up now. Thomas Sidebottom and numerous mentions of a William Sidebottom, the earliest dating to 1779. So there are a bunch of different Sidebottoms being named, and the last one here that shows up is from records of Prince William County from their regional library publication, Prince William Reliquary from October 2006. Mary Sidebottom was allowed £3 for her support, her sons being in the Continental Service in November 1778. And that would be John and Joseph Sidebottom. And then a following record which names her from the Virginia State Library Auditor's Account Book, 1779 to 1780, from page 21. Warrant for Mary Sidebottom of Prince William County, mother of a soldier, for her support, dated August 9th, 1779. So a family connection has been established between John and Joseph brothers, Nancy, sister, and primary records from the pension file of Charles Lander indicating that brothers John and Joseph are of non-white ancestry or heritage, and that's corroborated by sister Nancy in the 1810 census, and the mother of them being indicated as Mary Sidebottom, whose last known whereabouts or documentation of being alive are that date of August 9th, 1779. But the other Sidebottoms listed, Charles, Peter, and William and Thomas. Who are they? Well, there are a number of other records relating to the Sidebottoms in Prince William County, but the origins of them don't actually trace to Prince William County, and no records of them in Prince William County will actually go back before the 1770s. For earlier on, 1760s, 1750s, and so forth, actually got a look next door in what is now called King George County, Virginia, but what at the time in the 18th century would have been Stafford County, Virginia. And particularly the church and files of a church in question, St. Paul's Church, which again, now in King George County, what would have then been Stafford County. And the relevant volume of this church is the Register of St. Paul's Parish, dated or compiled from 1715 to 1798. And interestingly, the person who went to the church and looked through the actual transcription and recorded everything is the very same George Harrison Sanford King. And the volume dates to 1960. So the relevant files here are going to be where we can see a listing for a family of Sidebottom. Thomas, son of Peter and Sari Sidebottom. That's what is likely a mistranscription or misrecording. January 7th, 1736/7. And then blank, son of Peter and Sarah Sidebottom, 1741. And then William, son of Peter and Sarah Sidebottom, August 1743. So the one with the name not recorded must have died right at childbirth or in like very young infancy. But Thomas and William are named sons. And then on the following page, 124, Charles, son of Peter and Sarah Sidebottom, born March 1745. Now the slash is to note that the new year, as we celebrate it, now starts on January 1st, but they were still on the old calendar at that time. So March 25th was actually the start of a new year. So Charles, next born son, March 1745, but what would be, if we were counting by January 1st being the start of the year, January would have been March 1746. Peter, a free mulatto, son of Peter and Sarah Sidebottom, born April 9th, 1748. Now, this is the third and last of the primary records that lists and gives mention of the Sidebottoms as being a mixed race family. But this is also in many ways the most important of the mentions because it's the earliest of them, rather than being dating to 1810 and being Nancy in the census, or 1832 and it being Charles Lander's pension file making mention of the brothers he'd served with half a century or more earlier, being of mixed race. Here, there's a file dating to the actual birth of one of the Sidebottom children, and he's labeled as a free mixed race individual. So Peter, a free mulatto. And then notice there's a gap of a decade. And then Anne, daughter of Peter and Sarah Sidebottom, born August 1758. So John and Joseph slot in that decade between Peter and Anne. John's, based on pension application data, John Sidebottom's birth year is 1750, and Joseph Sidebottom's birth year is 1755. So even though they're not named here, they fit in that decade between Peter in 1748 and Anne in 1758. And what's very interesting about this as well is that the Peter who's listed as a free mulatto, so the one listing of all the children indicated as being mixed race, but that designation applying to all of them because they're all labeled as children of the same parents, Peter and Sarah Sidebottom. I directly descend from Peter Sidebottom, and he's my sixth great grandfather. So born there in 1748, he died between February 15th and August 15th, 1831 in Pulaski County, Kentucky. Had a wife named Nancy, and then descend through his daughter, Nancy Sidebottom, and so on through the generations. And the family line stayed settled pretty much there in Pulaski County, Kentucky, down to my parents, Charles Richardson II and Marie Dempsey. So I descend from the family, but there's been a lot of misinformation listed online on hundreds of family trees about the Sidebottoms of, okay, if their parents are Peter and Sidebottom, what's the ancestry, what's the heritage? And we actually have a clue with my sixth great grandfather, Peter, being labeled a free mulatto in 1748, because that wasn't just a catch-all term that meant someone of mixed race. It actually had a legal definition in Virginia. And from the website Free African Americans, Paul Highland is the foremost researcher of colonial era families of color. But from the section of his introduction, he includes relevantly definition of mulatto as it related from a legislative sense. And in August 1705, John Bunch, quote unquote, a mulatto, and Sarah Sladen, a white woman, wanted to get married. But this so caused controversy and headache for the court that they passed a new law as a result of this prospective interracial marriage. And Virginia passed a law 2 months later in October 1705, quote, for the clearing all manner of doubts, who shall be accounted a mulatto? Be it enacted and declared that the child of an Indian and the child, grandchild, or great-grandchild of a Negro shall be deemed, accounted, held, and taken to be mulatto. So that means by the standards of the Virginia statutes passed in October 1705, anyone who is either of unadmixed African descent or had an African or African American parent, grandparent, or great-grandparent legally fell under the classification of being a mulatto and mixed race. And that holds to until October 1785, in which Virginia law revised it so that every person who shall have 1/4 or more of Negro blood shall in like manner be deemed a mulatto. So the 1785 law revision did away with the 1/8, but that would have been in place when Peter was listed as such in 1748. Now, the fact that the mentions of Nancy in the 1810 census applies after the repealing of 1/8 classification would imply that the family was therefore of 1/4 African ancestry. And this was also tracked with the fact that Peter being listed a free mulatto could not have been biracial because Charles, Peter, John, and Joseph all migrated to Kentucky and reinvented themselves as wholly European descended individuals, as white presenting individuals. And they only would have been able to do that if they had the phenotypical fair-skinned, light-skinned advantage ability to racially pass. And therefore, that wouldn't have worked if they were 50% African American or African. So therefore, it makes sense and it reasons that they would have had to have been at the standard of 1/4 African or African American. Now, so which parent does this ancestry trace through? Well, we can actually find some interesting things there related to the father, Peter. From a newspaper from Rhines Virginia Gazette from Williamsburg, Virginia, dated Thursday, April 22nd, 1773, from page 3. It's a little hard to see here, but was it for crimes? Peter Sidebottom from Stafford for horse stealing, guilty. So Peter Sidebottom, the father of the mixed race Sidebottom children, is convicted of horse stealing in April 1773, and it indicates that he is from Stafford County. So the guilty verdict is rendered. This has the rather terrible actual outcome of that 2 weeks later, Thursday, May 6th, 1773, page 2 from Rhines Virginia Gazette out of Williamsburg, being the same newspaper. So sentenced at the Capitol, again, it's a little blurry here to see, but Peter Sidebottom for horse stealing, death. So Peter Sidebottom is actually executed. But while he dies in 1773, after being sentenced and executed for horse stealing, what are his origins? This is where a lot of family trees have, without sources or actual reference, stapled him to a different personage from Manchester, England. But we can actually correspond this person, or the Peter Sidebottom of the mixed race Sidebottom family, and he being the father, with a different record. And it turns out that even though he was executed for horse stealing, it was not the first time that Peter Sidebottom had run afoul of the law, because there's a volume titled More Emigrants in Bondage, 1614 to 1775, by a researcher named Peter Wilson Coldham. And listed there is, on page 158, Peter Sidebottom of Salford, SQS, Jan 1724, T April 1725, LA. So this indicates that Peter Sidebottom of Salford, which is in Lancashire, in northern England, and he was sentenced at the Special Court of Sessions in January 1724, and he was transported so sent away from England as a convict, and therefore as an indentured servant, April 1725. And it's important here to note that doesn't mean he languished in jail for 15 months between January and April of the following year. This was still the old calendar, where 1725 began on March 25th. So 3 months actually after being sentenced is when he's sent away from England, from jolly old homeland, and from Lancashire for whatever his crime in question was. But it would seem to reason that this is the Peter in question. There's no other Peter who shows up in Virginia that is an option. And when we looked for further records of the Peter Sidebottom, who again was of Salford, we can find that Peter Sidebottom was baptized July 21st, 1703, in the Diocese of Manchester, England. And it's hard, maybe a little hard to see here, but on line 21 there, Peter, son to Thomas Sidebottom of Salford. So the Peter Sidebottom who's convicted and sentenced in 1724 and sent to the New World in April 1725, was born and baptized, and the baptism at this point usually occurred 2 weeks after birth. So born early July 1703 in Salford, Lancashire, England, and his father's named Thomas Sidebottom. And this, again, when we go back to the St. Paul's Parish Registry, this is further corroborated by when you look at the naming patterns of Peter and Sarah Sidebottom. Their first named child, firstborn son, Thomas, January what we would now call 1737. So Peter named his firstborn son Thomas. Now, this Thomas died young because he doesn't show up in later records in Stafford or Prince William counties. But the William, born in 1743, becomes the eldest living of the Sidebottom children. And on the next page there, the two Sidebottoms are named of the following generation: Sarah, daughter of William, and Elizabeth Sidebottom, born 1767, and Thomas, son of William and Elizabeth Sidebottom, born February 1769. So William, the eldest surviving son of Peter and Sarah, names his firstborn son Thomas after, again, what is going to be his father's father. So the naming patterns of Peter and Thomas follow through in the family lines exactly as you would expect them to, with Thomas of Salford being the father of Peter of Salford from 1703. So this tells us that Peter Sidebottom, the father of the mixed race Sidebottom children, was English. He was an Englishman, and therefore of wholly European origin. And this is corroborated also with DNA evidence. So on 23andMe, one of my distant relatives is a male Sidebottom, who, for purposes of anonymity, we'll refer to as Max. Max and I are sharing one stretch of DNA in common, and Max Sidebottom is my sixth cousin, and his paternal grandparents were from Somerset, Pulaski County, where my family's from. And here's a version of his family tree that leads up to Peter Sidebottom and Nancy of Pulaski County. So Max is a Sidebottom from my branch of the family that settled in Pulaski County. And 23andMe includes what are called the haplogroups, your direct mother's maternal line, and paternal haplogroups, your fathers, direct paternal line. And that DNA signature is indicated as being European in origin. The specific haplogroup there, IPF4135, traces back to Eurasia. And if we look at descendant branches of it, you can see there are people whose Y DNA signature shows Virginia. That doesn't really help narrow it down because that's the New World. But above that, someone is labeled as being from Ireland. And then below that further, Wales, Great Britain, Isle of Man, Great Britain, Germany, Scotland. So these descendant DNA branches from this Y DNA paternal haplogroup all trace to various places in Europe. So both the primary records and the DNA evidence showed that the direct paternal line of the family is European and English in origin. This therefore means that the mixed race status of the Sidebottom children has to come through their mother. And I variously refer to her as Sarah Mary. Sarah, because she's listed in the St. Paul's Parish Registry as Sarah, but in the records of the two mentions in Prince William County, when she's receiving payment on behalf of her son serving in the Continental Army, she's listed as Mary. But these have to be the same person. So apropos, Sarah Mary. Now, one way we can solve this is by turning to DNA evidence. And one person in question is kind of the key to help understand Sarah Mary's own mixed race origins, because again, she would have been biracial. A lot of people, a lot of Sidebottom descendants, including myself, who've tested either are too far down in descent to have inherited maybe any African DNA segments from these specific ancestors, or the segments might be too small to be very helpful in terms of research. But several years back in doing my research, I found one cousin who's kind of the perfect avenue for this, and we'll call her Val. Val is a great-great-granddaughter of both Charles and John Sidebottom, with her great-grandparents being Sidebottom first cousins who married. And so kind of double dose of the Sidebottom genes. But Val was born approximately a century ago, being born in the first half of the 1920s. And her father was born in the 1860s. So her connection to the generation of identified mixed race individuals of the Sidebottom siblings, Charles and John, she's only 4 generations removed from them, and is the most genealogically senior descendant of the family to have ever tested, and almost certainly whoever will have tested, because there aren't going to be that many 110, 115-year-old Sidebottom descendants wandering around to still maybe get a DNA test result from. So there's a relevant feature here called a chromosome painting. And these are for Val from admixture calculators on a website called GEDmatch. This is her chromosome painting from the 22 pairs of autosomes we inherit from both parents. Look at what are labeled the African segments in the chart. 1 on chrome 2, 2 on chromosome 3, 1 at the end of chromosome 5. Then there's 1 near the start of chromosome 8, 1 near the end of chromosome 10, 1 near the start of chromosome 15. And then the last 2 are on corresponding chromosomes, chromosome 19, and then at the end, towards the end stretch of chromosome 20. So Val has 9 African segments, significantly measurable African segments inherited. And here's another admixture painting showing it with different coloration, just so it's a little more easy to pick up on. This time the segments are in red. Now, there's a website called Family Tree DNA where it shows it in a bit more detail. It predicts that her African ancestry traces to Central Africa. That's going to be wrong because Family Tree DNA is not as precise as other companies like 23andMe and Ancestry. But the relevant part here is it labels all the African segments except for a mislabeling on chromosome 8, where it shows it as being inherited through both parents. But where it says haplotype 22222, that means all the African ancestry that Val's inherited has come from the same parent, which is exactly what we would expect to see, considering Val's father was a great grandchild of Charles and John Sidebottom. Now, through a lot of complicated research and comparing Val's ancestry and chromosome painting and matching segments between websites like Family Tree DNA, MyHeritage, and GEDmatch, I was actually able to fully map out her 9 African segments. So there they are located on the chromosomes in question. And there she is. You can see at the top, Val, the most genealogically senior Sidebottom descendant to have taken an autosomal DNA test. And the measurement length, what we would call CM length, of each of the DNA segments she inherited from her biracial ancestor, Sarah Mary. Now, the DNA results here for Val are going to point a huge clue forward. Val tested, first DNA tested with Ancestry in May 2018 and was predicted to have 2% Africa, Southeastern Bantu ancestry. But then after an update, it became what we would call the region of Benin and Togo. And people often get somewhat surprised or confused about this of like, why do my DNA regions change? Well, that's going to refer to our deceased ancestors are not actually having DNA analysis done on them, right? So companies use living reference panels, population of unadmixed ancestry, with parentage and grandparentage, and maybe even great-grandparentage, known to be originate from a specific geographic global region. So when Val originally was predicted as being Africa, Southeastern Bantu, and that Ancestry's reference panel at that time dated to 2013, I mean, they only had 18 samples for that global continental region. And the Benin Togo region only had 60 samples. But after an update in 2018, notice that the samples jumped into the hundreds. So after a lot more expansive samples, and it expands in the 2018 Ancestry update to over 16,000 individuals from what had been 3,000 in the earlier reference panel. The Benin and Togo reference panel includes 224 individuals, and the 3 geographically closest African regions, Ivory Coast and Ghana to the west, Mali to the north, and Nigeria to the east, all have over 100 samples. And this indicating the general predicted region in which that ancestry in West Central Africa could have traced to. But an interesting thing happened between 2018 and now, in that every year, Ancestry releases DNA updates and adds more samples to its reference panel. And with each subsequent update, the predicted region got more precise and narrowed in on a geographically smaller region of West Central Africa, but it never shifted from Benin and Togo itself. And it's always predicted at 2%. So once it kind of hit stasis here, shows that could be the ancestry could be from Benin and Togo or westward into Ghana. But some of the commentary here includes this is especially true of West Africa, where migrations, conquests, and intermarriage within allied kingdoms help explain why, for example, many people from our Benin and Togo region also have DNA that looks similar to our profile for Nigeria. And in the updates from 2022, there was one update in which VALS predicted Benin and Togo African ancestry jumped to 3%, but then in a further update, went back to the 2% it had been on every previous version. And after the 2022 update, and at this current time in 2023, there are 336 DNA reference samples for the Benin and Togo region, and the regions closest to it, Ivory Coast and Ghana, have there are over 300 for Ivory Coast and Ghana. For the region to the north, Mali, over 500. And then Nigeria now has two regions, the regions to the east of Benin and Togo, which account for over 1,000 samples in the reference panel. So the fact that at all times, her Val's ancestry has been predicted to be Benin and Togo is a strong indication that that is the actual region. But it could still be one of those regions, possibly either side, because of genetic assimilation and national borders being an invention of colonial empires, right? Like ancestral peoples didn't live in a nation that was determined by Germany or France or England at some later point in time about border partition. So this shows that this is the geographically most likely region in which Sarah Mary's African parentage traces to either Ghana, Togo, Benin, or roughly the western half of Nigeria. So within these 3+ countries, across these 4 countries, there are dozens of different peoples and ethnic communities and tribes. So it's not possible to say at this point in time exactly which specific people Sarah Mary's African parent came from. We are able to actually narrow down through the level of VAL's DNA testing her generational proximity, and that all 2%, all 9 segments are Sidebottom, match with other Sidebottom descendants, and are known to come from the same West African source. And this region is backed up because when we look at the samples, look at the long middle stretch on chromosome 3 and the small chromosome stretch on chromosome 20. I have relatives on 23andMe who are sharing the same Sidebottom segments, but those segments are labeled Ghanaian, Liberian, and Sierra Leonean. And they're the chrome 3 segment. And Ghanaian, Liberian, and Sierra Leonean, Ghana being the easternmost of the countries indicated, but 23andMe doesn't have a Benin and Togo region. So this is, again, that close geographic regional West African fit. And they're in their reference panel as well. They have hundreds of individuals as well, though less and less specificity than ancestries. All told, again, the data from both companies just indicates that Sarah Mary's African ancestry traced to Ghana, Togo, Benin, or Western Nigeria. And this allows for the reconstruction of a intended complete family tree for the Sidebottoms for the first time. So at the bottom there is my ancestor, Peter, but the ancestry would hold true for John, he who helped save the life of young wounded James Monroe at the Battle of Trenton, John, who also served in the 3rd Virginia Regiment, Nancy, who stayed in Virginia, and also brothers William and Charles as well. So the parents being Peter Sidebottom or Sidebottom, Peter being born July 1703, Salford, Lancashire, England, died May 1773, Williamsburg, Virginia. And then his parentage being Thomas Sidebottom of Salford, Lancashire, England, born circa 1685 or earlier, if we allow a minimum age of him being 18 at the birth of his son, and an unidentified woman, but who would have also been of Lancashire, England, and born circa 1687 or earlier, allowing for her a minimum age of 16 or younger. And then when we turn to Sarah Mary, we know that she had to have been born between August 1713 and January 1720. And this is clued in from the birth order listing of the children in the St. Paul's Parish Registry, because the firstborn son, Thomas, who didn't survive to adulthood, but assuming that she was no younger than 16 at the time of his birth, then that would put her latest birth date at 1720. And assuming she was no older than 45, which would be significantly advanced in age, but no older than 45 at the birth of the last child recorded for Peter and Sarah, who's Nancy in 1758. That means she had been born within the 7-year span. She couldn't have been born after the 1720 window, and she couldn't have been born before the 1713 window. And we also know she's going to have been from Virginia, and that she herself was biracial and of a mixed European and African ancestry. And we know that she died after August 1779, because that's the last time she shows up in the historical record, receiving payment on behalf of aid for her son's service, and she was then in Prince William County. So we know that since one of Sarah Mary's parents was African, or what is often termed an Atlantic Creole, born of unadmixed African parents, it's going to almost certainly be her father, who was African or born to unadmixed West African parents, because after a law passed in the 1660s by the Virginia legislature, slavery was inherited through the status of the mother. So the mother had to be free in order for Sarah Mary to be free, even if her father was enslaved or had later become free, but had originally been transported as an enslaved individual or to enslaved parents. So this therefore implies that Sarah Mary's mother is an unidentified woman, presumably of unadmixed European ancestry, born circa 1704 or earlier, and that Sarah Mary's father was either an African himself or born to African parents of unadmixed West African ancestry, almost certainly from present-day Ghana, Togo, Benin, or Nigeria, and that he was born circa 1702 or earlier. And from a wounded James Monroe at the Battle of Trenton, who would later go on and become the 5th president of the United States, who could have thought where it would all lead, or actually how complicated and interesting and multifaceted the family of the free African-American man who helped save his life actually was. So this is that story that I have to share, and some of the larger history and genetic ancestry and heritage of the Sidebottom family themselves. So, Nancy, I'm happy to turn it back over to you now.
Well, Caleb, thank you so much for your sharing your research. I mean, just your depth and detail you've been able to discover is, I mean, it's incredible. We are really, we're very honored, you know, that you were willing to present for us today, and we thank you so much for your time and just this. I'm totally blown away.
Well, I hope the presentation will be of interest to plenty of people, researchers, not just Monroe researchers or presidential historians, but also those interested in like overlooked historical stories, right? And I think the Sidebottoms are a really interesting case study of being right time, right place, but also still have slipped through the cracks for seemingly 2.5 centuries, you know?
And just like the way you wove in the DNA to kind of give a scaffolding to generational you know, chronology. I mean, that was just incredible too. So I mean, really, this was so valuable on so many different levels. And thank you again so much today.
Well, thank you so much for hosting me, and it was my pleasure to deliver the presentation, and I hope everyone enjoys it.